Picture this: a mother hiding her children in the cellar as soldiers storm the village, a monk scribbling remedies by candlelight while the plague claims lives outside his door, a farmer planting seeds in soil cracked by drought, praying for just one more harvest. These weren't scenes from a grim fantasy. They were everyday realities for people living through the Middle Ages, an era where survival wasn't guaranteed but earned through grit, wit, and sheer determination. Across centuries marked by relentless plagues, devastating famines, and endless wars, ordinary people faced horrors we can barely fathom today. Yet somehow, against impossible odds, they found ways to endure, and their stories of resilience still echo through time. What does it take to survive when the world seems determined to break you? That's the question at the heart of today's journey. We're uncovering 24 of the most astonishing survival tales from medieval history, each one a testament to human ingenuity and courage. Think of the merchant who bartered his way through a siege by trading secrets instead of gold, or the village that outsmarted the Black Death by isolating before anyone understood how disease spread. These aren't just dusty old accounts, they're masterclasses in adaptability, packed with lessons that resonate even now. Because while we may not face sword-wielding invaders or mysterious fevers today, the core challenges: fear, scarcity, uncertainty are timeless. So why do these medieval stories matter now? Because they remind us that hope isn't something you find, it's something you build piece by piece, even in the darkest moments. Over the next hour, we'll walk alongside peasants who became heroes, outcasts who turned the tide, and forgotten voices who refused to be silenced. You'll discover how a single clever idea could mean the difference between life and death, how communities bound together when everything fell apart, and how the human spirit, no matter how battered, can still shine. This isn't just history, it's a mirror, and by the end, you might just see a bit of yourself in these survivors too. Let's step into their world together. The Middle Ages weren't just hard, they were a gauntlet of relentless suffering. Imagine waking up to the sound of church bells tolling for yet another plague victim, or watching your crops wither under a sky that hadn't seen rain in months. This was a time when life hinged on variables no one could control: the whims of weather, the march of armies, the invisible spread of disease. Cities, crammed with people and filth, became breeding grounds for disaster. Streets reeked of waste, and the concept of sanitation was centuries away. Medicine, often more lethal than the ailments it tried to cure. Bloodletting, potions of crushed gemstones, and prayers were standard remedies. Yet in this landscape of despair, ordinary people did extraordinary things. Take the famine of 1315, when a sudden climate shift, later called the Little Ice Age, triggered years of failed harvests. Starving peasants resorted to eating bark and weeds, while others turned to ingenious solutions. In one village, a baker stretched his dwindling flour by mixing it with ground acorns, creating a bitter but life-saving bread. Meanwhile, monasteries became unexpected hubs of resilience. Monks meticulously recorded which wild plants were edible, turning their gardens into laboratories of survival. These weren't acts of desperation, they were calculated adaptations, proof that even in the bleakest moments, the human mind could outmaneuver fate. War, too, shaped survival in cruel ways. Villages lying in the path of armies didn't just face destruction, they faced annihilation. But here's the twist: some communities learned to negotiate rather than resist. A scribe's chronicle from Burgundy tells of a town that avoided slaughter by offering to supply the invading army with fresh horses and guides. In return, their homes were spared. It was a risky bargain, but it worked. others took to the hills, building hidden settlements in caves or dense forests, their locations so well guarded that some ruins weren't discovered until modern times. What ties these stories together isn't just suffering, it's agency. The medieval world was brutal, but it wasn't static. People observed, adapted, and sometimes even thrived. A merchant might lose his fortune to bandits one year, then rebuild it by trading along safer routes the next. A widow, barred from most professions, could become a respected brewer because ale making was considered women's work. These weren't exceptions, they were the rule. Survival wasn't passive, it was a craft honed daily. Now, let's meet our first survivor, a linen weaver from Flanders who turned the tides of the Black Death with a single, radical idea. While others fled or prayed, she noticed something odd. The disease seemed to spread fastest in crowded, filthy spaces. So she convinced her neighbors to burn the contaminated bedding of the sick and isolate the afflicted in a barn outside town. It went against every norm of the time, where tending to the ill was seen as a sacred duty, but her defiance saved countless lives, decades before doctors understood contagion. Her name is lost to history, but her lesson endures. Sometimes survival means daring to see what others refuse to. Venice in the 1300s was a city of contradictions. Opulent palaces stood alongside streets choked with the dying, as the Black Death swept through like an invisible tide. In this chaos, one merchant saw what others didn't. Panic was as deadly as the plague itself. Marco, a textile trader with a network of contacts stretching from Constantinople to London, didn't just rely on luck or prayer. He observed, while nobles barricaded themselves in gilded rooms and peasants clutched holy relics, he noticed something crucial. The disease moved fastest where people gathered. So he made a plan that defied convention. First, he moved his family to a wine cellar beneath their home, its thick stone walls acting as a natural barrier. Then came the details others overlooked: vinegar-soaked cloths to mask the stench of decay, strict rotations for venturing outside, and a ledger tracking every ounce of food. Marco's true genius, though, lay in his trades. While markets collapsed, he bartered not for silks or spices, but for information. A dockworker's tip about a ship found adrift, its crew dead at the oars, told him which neighborhoods to avoid. A baker's rumor about a sudden fever in the Rialto became his cue to seal the cellar tighter. But here's what makes his story extraordinary. Marco didn't hoard his knowledge. He shared it strategically. To the carpenter who reinforced their hiding place, he offered a future stake in his business. To the herb seller who provided juniper and sage for purifying the air, he promised protection for her grandchildren. These weren't just transactions, they were alliances forged in crisis. When the plague receded 2 years later, Marco's household emerged intact, not just surviving, but positioned to rebuild. His ledger, preserved in Venice's archives, shows how he turned survival into strategy. One page lists dwindling food supplies, the next sketches a map for new trade routes, bypassing decimated ports. What separates Marco from the countless victims of the Black Death wasn't wealth or privilege, it was his refusal to see disaster as an end. Where others froze, he adapted. While the world crumbled, he planted seeds for the future. His story echoes in modern crises, from pandemics to economic collapses, reminding us that preparation isn't just about stocks of food or locked doors. It's about understanding how chaos works and bending its rules to your will. Now, shift your gaze from Venice's shadowy cellars to the sun-scorched fields of medieval Provence, where another kind of survivor, a peasant woman named Alais, faced a different scourge, famine. Where Marco outthought the plague, Alais outplayed starvation itself. Agnes woke to the sound of her children's empty stomachs growling. The third summer without rain had turned their fields to dust, and the village grain stores had vanished months ago. While others dug for roots or chewed on leather belts, Agnes slipped into the woods at dawn, not in despair, but with purpose. Years of tending herbs for the local midwife had taught her what others dismissed as weeds could be lifelines. Nettles stung her fingers as she gathered them, but boiled twice, they became a soup rich in iron. Acorns, bitter and toxic raw, could be leached in running water for days, then ground into flour. Even the dandelions choking the footpaths offered greens and roots that could roast into a passable coffee substitute. What made Agnes extraordinary wasn't just her knowledge, it was her willingness to share it. When the village priest declared the famine god's punishment, she quietly demonstrated how to strip bark from elm trees without killing them, the inner layer yielding a gruel that kept 3 families alive. She showed mothers how to spot henbit, a purple-flowered weed packed with more nutrients than their vanished cabbages. At first, some scoffed. Why eat weeds when the Lord's hunting grounds were full of game? But Agnes knew the truth. Those forests were patrolled by armed guards, and stealing a deer meant hanging. The land itself, though, owed no taxes. Her greatest act of defiance came when the village headman accused her of witchcraft for making food appear from dirt. Instead of cowering, Agnes led him to a clearing where she'd transplanted chicory and burdock. Does the devil make plants grow straight from Genesis? She challenged. The headman, shamed by the gaunt faces of his own grandchildren, relented. By autumn, half the village followed her into the woods each morning, their baskets filled with nature's hidden bounty. They survived not just through Agnes's knowledge, but through her refusal to let pride override pragmatism. Centuries later, botanists would confirm what Agnes instinctively knew: many weeds she foraged contained more vitamins than cultivated crops. Her story echoes in modern survival guides and urban foraging movements, proving that scarcity often hides solutions in plain sight. The real lesson: survival isn't just about finding resources, it's about seeing the world differently. While knights and kings dominate history books, it was a peasant woman's keen eye and stubborn generosity that wrote a quieter, more enduring kind of heroism. Now picture a dungeon so deep even rats starved there, yet somehow one knight turned his captivity into a masterclass in escape. Sir Godfrey's fingers bled as he scraped another handful of damp earth from the tunnel wall. Captured after the Battle of Crecy in 1346, he'd been thrown into a dungeon so deep even the jailers forgot his name. But where others saw despair, the knight saw opportunity. His only tool, a rusty spoon stolen during a guard's moment of carelessness. Night after night, while rats scuttled over straw pallets and his fellow prisoners groaned in their sleep, he dug slowly, silently, his progress measured in inches. The work was grueling. A single misstep, one clatter of displaced stone, and he'd hang at dawn. Yet for 12 relentless months, he chipped away, disguising the tunnel's entrance beneath his own ragged cloak, smuggling the dirt out bit by bit in his mealtime bread loaf. What makes his escape extraordinary isn't just the audacity, it's the psychology. Prisoners who tried brute force died screaming in the courtyard. But Godfrey understood his captor's fatal flaw: arrogance. They assumed no one would attempt the impossible, so he gave them exactly what they expected: a broken man, head bowed, shuffling to receive his daily gruel. Meanwhile, beneath their boots, a narrow shaft inched toward the outer wall. When the night finally came, he slithered through the tunnel like a shadow, emerging into a moonlit thicket. By sunrise, he was 10 miles away, posing as a pilgrim on the road to Calais. His story wasn't just about escape, it was about redefining captivity. While his body was imprisoned, his mind remained fiercely free. Centuries later, archaeologists would find remnants of similar tunnels beneath medieval fortresses. proof that Godfrey wasn't alone in his ingenuity. But his legacy endures because he didn't just flee, he outthought the system. In modern terms, he hacked it, turning the guards' neglect into his advantage, their routine into his camouflage. Now, shift your gaze from dungeons to a place where death itself was defied not by force, but by knowledge. High in the Alps, a secluded monastery became an unlikely fortress against the Black Death, thanks to rules so strict they bordered on prophetic. While cities burned with plague, these monks survived by doing the unthinkable, rejecting compassion in the name of survival. Their secret, a quarantine protocol so ruthless it saved every soul within their walls. High in the Swiss Alps, where winter winds howled like vengeful spirits, stood the monastery of St. Gaul, a fortress of faith with its granaries nearly empty and its gates barred against an army of mercenaries. The year was 1410, and the siege had dragged on for months. Outside the walls, soldiers grew desperate, burning nearby villages for supplies. Inside, the monks faced a grim calculus. Their last sack of barley could bake one final loaf of bread, or it could brew something far more valuable. Brother Elias, the monastery's cellar master, made the choice that would save them all. With practiced hands, he soaked the precious grains in melted snow, coaxing forth a weak but fermentable wort. In normal times, this would become beer for feast days, but these were not normal times. As the brew fermented in stolen barrels, Elias discovered something miraculous. The liquid, though barely drinkable, could cleanse wounds better than their dwindling vinegar. When a raiding party finally scaled the walls at midnight, it wasn't swords or prayers that drove them back. It was vats of boiling ale hurled from the parapets. The scalding liquid sent invaders tumbling into the snow, their burns festering less than those cut by blades. Word spread among the besiegers. These monks wielded some unholy weapon. But the true masterstroke came later. Under flag of truce, Elias offered the mercenary captain a cask not as tribute but as trade. "A drink to warm your men," he said, in exchange for salt and bandages. The captain, half frozen and weary of stale rations, agreed. What began as barter became routine. Week after week, the monks exchanged ale for eggs, for wool, even for information about the enemy's weakening numbers. By spring, the mercenaries were gone. Some said lured away by richer targets. Others whispered they'd grown too fond of the monastery's holy brew. The monk's story endures not just for its ingenuity, but for its layered wisdom. They transformed scarcity into currency, turned their enemies' vices against them, and proved that survival often hinges on seeing resources in unexpected places. Centuries later, scientists would confirm what Elias stumbled upon: alcohol's antiseptic properties. But in that moment, it was simply one man's refusal to let despair dictate the terms. Now imagine a different kind of siege, not of stone walls, but of a child's quick mind. In a Breton village overrun by raiders, 12-year-old Assot would teach her captors the peril of underestimating the young. The flames swallowed Eleonora's village before she could even scream. At just 9 years old, she crouched behind a smoldering haycart, her bare feet blistering on hot earth as raiders dragged away the last of the survivors. In that moment, she made a choice that would save her life. She grabbed a fallen knife, sawed off her long braids, and rubbed soot into her face until her features blurred into shadow. When dawn came, she wasn't Eleonora anymore. She was Ned, a grubby orphan boy shuffling behind a group of spice merchants too weary to question an extra pair of hands. What followed wasn't just hiding, it was transformation. She mimicked the boys' swagger, spat like they did, even mastered their crude jokes. When a merchant eyed her too closely, she volunteered to clean his mud-caked boots, knowing servants became invisible. At night, she slept curled around a stolen dagger, but by day, she turned her greatest weakness into strength. A scrawny lad like you, the caravan master scoffed when she asked to guard the supply carts. So she proved him wrong, learning to mend harnesses, spot thieves in crowded markets, even haggle in 3 broken languages. By 12, she could barter a bolt of linen for double its worth in salt. By 14, she navigated trade routes like a seasoned traveler. Yet the true test came years later when the caravan stopped at a ruined village. The well where she'd drawn water was choked with bones. The raiders who'd spared her as a boy now drank at the local tavern, their laughter echoing through the same square where she'd played as a child. Revenge would have been easy, a knife in the dark, poison in their ale. But Eleonora, still disguised as Ned, simply traded them a barrel of spoiled wine for a good horse and rode west. Survival, she'd learned, wasn't about vengeance, it was about freedom. Her story endures because it defies the simplest morals. She didn't triumph by sword or sorcery, but by observing human nature's blind spots. People see what they expect. A dirty boy was harmless, forgettable. A girl would have been prey. Historians still debate whether her merchant life continued or if she ever reclaimed her name. But perhaps that's the point. Her power lay in the choosing. Now, turn your gaze from smoky roads to the flicker of a single candle in a plague-ridden town, where a midwife's forbidden knowledge made her both savior and outcast. While priests preached penance, she mixed remedies from whispered traditions. Saving lives with method science wouldn't validate for centuries. Her tale isn't just medicine, it's the cost of being right too soon. Beatrice's hands moved with quiet precision as she crushed dried yarrow leaves into a mortar, the sharp scent cutting through the stench of death that clung to her plague-stricken village. While physicians bled patients with leeches and bishops urged repentance, she worked in secret, mixing tonics of elderberry for fever, brewing willow bark tea for pain, and wrapping the dying in linen soaked in vinegar and thyme. Her remedies were ancient, passed down from her grandmother in whispered lessons, but to the church they smelled of heresy. What made Beatrice dangerous wasn't just her knowledge, it was her results. Where the town doctor's patients died screaming, hers often lived. A mother of 3, left to perish in a pest house, walked home after drinking Beatrice's bitter infusion. A blacksmith's son, his skin already mottled with the telltale buboes, recovered under her care while his neighbors perished, but survival had a price. When the local priest found her gathering belladonna under a full moon, a plant she used sparingly to dull agony, he saw only witchcraft. The trial that followed should have been her end. Bound in chains, accused of consorting with demons, Beatrice faced a crowd hungry for someone to blame. Yet when the magistrate demanded she renounce her devil's cures, she did the unthinkable, she offered proof. Pulling back her sleeve, she revealed a faded scar. 2 winters passed, the sweating sickness took half this village, she said. You called my sister's survival a miracle. It was only comfrey and honey. The room fell silent. Even her accusers knew the truth. Their own wives had slipped through her door at night, seeking help they couldn't find elsewhere. They banished her instead of burning her, a mercy won by the very family she'd saved. As Beatrice vanished into the forest with nothing but her satchel of seeds, the village learned a harsh lesson. Sometimes the line between heresy and hope is drawn by those too afraid to admit they're wrong. Centuries later, science would vindicate her. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the foundation of aspirin. Thyme oil kills bacteria. But her real legacy isn't in textbooks, it's in the courage to trust observation over dogma, even when the crowd cries witch. Now set sail from the shadowed woods to the open ocean, where a different kind of survivor faced a trial no herb could cure. Shipwrecked and alone, a Venetian sailor named Inzo would turn the sea's cruelty into an unlikely ally, not by fighting the waves, but by learning their rhythm. Pietro clung to the splintered mast as the waves swallowed what remained of his merchant ship. The storm had lasted 3 days, long enough to drown his crewmates, scatter their cargo of Sicilian olives to the depths, and leave him vomiting seawater onto the sand of an uncharted island. Most men would have died there. The place was little more than a crescent of rock, its few stunted trees bent sideways by the wind, but Pietro wasn't most men. His first act wasn't despair, it was inventory. Salt-crusted but intact, his belt still held 3 vital tools: a rusted fishhook, a length of twine, and the small knife every sailor carried to cut rigging. With these, he turned the island into his reluctant ally. The knife carved notches in palm trunks to collect rainwater. The fishhook, baited with rotting crabs, became a trap for seagulls. And when fever set in from a festering wound, he pressed the blade to hot stones, sterilizing it before lancing the infection himself. What truly saved him, though, was his obsession with time. Using a stick and tide marks, he tracked the moon's phases like a human calendar. This told him when schools of fish would swim closest to shore, when seabirds nested, even when certain berries ripened on the mainland visible across the strait. After 7 months, he'd gathered enough driftwood to lash together a raft, its sail woven from his own tattered shirt. The current carried him to a fishing village where his sun-blackened skin and wild eyes made the locals cross themselves until he spoke in the dialect of Genoa, proving he was no ghost. Pietro's story endures because it strips survival down to its essence, knowledge over luck. Where others saw barren isolation, he saw systems, patterns in nature that could be harnessed, tiny advantages amplified through patience. Modern survival experts still teach his techniques, but his real lesson is subtler. The moment he stopped seeing himself as a victim of the sea and became its student was the moment his fate turned. Now Hammer strikes echo through a very different kind of survival tale, one forged in fire and cunning. In a besieged French town, a blacksmith named Henry would turn his anvil into a weapon of war, proving that sometimes the strongest armor isn't worn, it's imagined. When the English army surrounded Henry's walled city in 1429, they expected quick surrender. The gates were splintering, the granaries nearly empty. But no one accounted for the blacksmith's furnace glowing defiantly through the night. While others hoarded bread, Henry hoarded scrap metal, broken plowshares, discarded helms, even the hinges from his own shop door. Night after night, he hammered them into brutal simplicity, iron caltrops, 4-pronged spikes designed to cripple horses. His true genius, though, lay in distribution. He taught children to scatter the spikes under straw where cavalry would charge. When the enemy's mounts began screaming and falling, their riders assumed witchcraft until a captured boy revealed the truth under torture. The next morning, English archers rained fire arrows onto Henry's workshop, aiming to end his threat. But smoke was part of his plan. Using the distraction, he led a team of apprentices through the sewers to the enemy's own siege engines, where they stuffed bellows with wet straw into the mechanisms. The machines choked and seized, buying the town 8 critical days, enough for reinforcements to arrive. Henry's legacy isn't just in the spikes still found on medieval battlefields. It's in the idea that survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about redirecting your enemy's force against them, a lesson as sharp as any blade. The forge in Henry's workshop glowed red as the town bells told warning enemy banners had been spotted on the horizon. By nightfall, the gates would be sealed, trapping them all inside. But where others saw doom, Henry saw potential. His hands, calloused from decades of shaping plows and horseshoes, now gripped something far deadlier, a scythe blade fresh from the fire, its curve hammered straight into a crude but lethal sword. This was no act of desperation, it was calculation. He knew the invading army expected cowering peasants, not farmers wielding repurposed tools. Henry's genius wasn't just in reforging metal, it was in reforging minds. Gathering the town's blacksmiths under the pretense of repairing the well chain, he showed them how to turn pitchforks into spears by reinforcing the tines with iron bands. A butter churn's paddle, when fitted with nails, became a mace. Even the church's copper candlesticks were melted down for arrowheads, but his masterstroke was psychological. He ordered every third weapon left unfinished, as if abandoned in haste. When scouts reported back to the enemy commander, the message was clear: these villagers were too disorganized to pose a threat. The ruse worked. On the night of the attack, the invaders stormed through poorly guarded alleys only to find death waiting in the shadows. A butcher's son swung a modified meat cleaver from a rooftop, severing a captain's reins. A weaver's daughter thrust a loom weight tied to a chain into a warhorse's legs, sending its rider crashing onto Henry's hidden spikes. By dawn, the enemy had retreated, baffled by the ferocity of people they dismissed as helpless. What makes Henry's rebellion extraordinary isn't just the victory, it's the lesson in perception. He understood that in survival, appearances are weapons too. A blacksmith's hammer could shape more than iron. It could reshape reality itself, making farmers into warriors and scrap metal into an army. Centuries later, historians would argue whether his tactics prolonged the war or simply bought time. But for those villagers, the answer didn't matter. They'd learned the most subversive truth of all, that ordinary hands, given the right tools, can rewrite history. Now shift from the clamor of battle to the silent terror of a different kind of siege, one where fire, not soldiers, pressed against the walls. In a convent near Strasbourg, Sister Marguerite would face a choice no devotional manual had prepared her for: obey the rule of enclosure or watch her sisters burn. Her escape plan relied not on strength, but on something far more dangerous to the medieval mind: a woman's knowledge of architecture. Smoke curled beneath the door of Sister Marguerite's cell before she even heard the shouts. The convent of St. Agnes was burning not from accident but by design. A mob, whipped into frenzy by rumors of hidden gold, had torched the orchard, and now flames licked at the cloister walls. The rule was clear: nuns never left enclosure, not even for fire. But as the other sisters clutched their rosaries and wept, Marguerite moved with eerie calm. Years earlier, as a novice scrubbing the chapel floor, she'd noticed something odd. A draft near the altar, faint but persistent. Now, with embers raining onto the choir stalls, she pried up the loose stone, revealing a chute so narrow they'd need to shed their wimples to squeeze through. What happened next wasn't just escape, it was transformation. The passage, likely dug by long-dead monks smuggling wine, dropped into a dry stream bed behind the convent. Marguerite went last, counting each sister as they emerged like specters into the moonlit night. But her true brilliance came after. Knowing the mob would hunt for women in holy garb, she led them not to the nearby village, but to a charcoal burner's abandoned hut. There she distributed the most unlikely disguises: charcoal-smudged faces, patched tunics left behind, even a stolen woodsman's axe for Sister Beatrice, whose trembling hands steadied when given purpose. By dawn, they weren't nuns anymore. They were a band of itinerant laborers, their shorn hair hidden under caps, their prayers silenced, the convent burned to its foundations. The mob, finding no treasure nor bodies, assumed the sisters had perished completely. Marguerite's leadership didn't just save lives, it rewrote them. For in that charcoal burner's hut, she'd also hidden something else: the convent's ledger, its pages listing every noble family who'd secretly birthed daughters there. Not gold, but a different kind of power. When spring came, those same families sheltered, a group of pious widows at their estates. Marguerite's lesson echoes through time: rules are made for normal days. Survival belongs to those who know when to bend them. Now, let's trade smoke for music and meet a minstrel who turned humiliation into salvation. In the court of a petty lord known for starving his entertainers, lute player Jakot survived not by flattery, but by weaponizing the one thing no one could steal, his memory. While others starved, he feasted on secrets, and when the time came, they served him better than any loaf of bread. Jakot's fingers trembled on the lute strings as the bandit leader's knife hovered near his throat. The forest clearing smelled of damp leaves and unwashed men, the kind of place where travelers usually vanished without a trace. But where a merchant might beg or a knight resist, the minstrel did something far more dangerous. He laughed. Not from courage, but from calculation. You'd kill me before hearing the song I wrote about your exploits, he teased, eyes flicking to the leader's scarred knuckles. Even the Duke of Burgundy pays silver for ballads about men like you. It was a gamble wrapped in flattery. Bandits, after all, were human, and humans crave recognition. Jakot didn't just play the lute that night. He wove a story around the fire, turning cutthroats into characters. The scar across the leader's cheek became a battlefield wound from defending a village. The stolen rings on their fingers were trophies from outwitting corrupt tax collectors. With each verse, the knives loosened, the ale flowed, and the outlaws saw themselves reflected not as monsters, but as rebels. A narrative so intoxicating that by dawn, they gifted him a stolen cloak and directions to the safest road. But the true brilliance lay in what Jakot didn't do. He never asked for freedom outright. Instead, he made them feel like heroes sparing a life, not fools being manipulated. His survival tactic charm as a weapon wasn't just about music. It was about understanding that even the hardest hearts have vanity to exploit. Now, shift from forest shadows to sun-baked fields, where an entirely different kind of cunning unfolded. While minstrels traded songs for mercy, farmers like Bertrand played a longer game. When the first signs of drought cracked the earth, his neighbors panicked, selling livestock for dwindling grain. But Bertrand had spent years observing how disasters unfold not in a straight line, but in waves. So while others emptied their stores, he dug. Beneath his sheepfold stone slab lay his masterpiece, a pit lined with straw and lime, filled not with grain, but with turnips and cabbages buried in layers of sand. The technique, passed down from his great-grandmother, preserved vegetables for over a year, long enough to outlast the worst famine. But Bertrand's genius wasn't just in hiding food. It was in hiding knowledge. He shared his stash sparingly, trading a single cabbage for a day's labor repairing his well. When thieves came sniffing, they found only the expected granary, its meager contents hardly worth stealing. The lesson: survival isn't just about resources, it's about misdirection. While the minstrel dazzled with stories, the farmer let silence do the work. Both understood the same truth. In desperate times, the real treasure isn't what you have, but what others don't know you have. Now, picture a different kind of hoard, one that couldn't be buried or bartered. In a plague-ravaged city, a scribe named Thomas would discover that the most valuable currency wasn't gold or grain, but something far more fragile: trust. The first cracks in the earth weren't what frightened Guillaume, it was the silence. No jingle of harnesses from the road, no distant laughter of children fetching water. Just the crows circling over fields gone too still. War was coming, not with trumpet blasts, but with the absence of ordinary sounds. While his neighbors drove carts of grain to sell at the garrison, Guillaume spent his nights digging. Not a shallow hole for panic, but a network of pits beneath his sheepfold, each lined with straw and sealed with clay. The work blistered his hands and bent his back, but he knew armies marched on empty stomachs, and hungry soldiers took what they pleased. His wife called it madness. "You'll rot good harvest for nothing," she scolded as he buried sack after sack of barley. But Guillaume had heard his grandfather's stories how after the last war, survivors traded a silver candlestick for a single loaf. So he layered his pits like a baker layering dough, grain at the bottom, then turnips packed in sand, then hazelnuts in woven baskets that wouldn't split. The final touch was genius in its simplicity. He scattered rotten apples over the last layer. If looters dug that far, the stink would convince them they'd found only spoiled stores. When the horsemen finally came, they left the countryside scorched. Guillaume's farmhouse burned like all the others, but the sheepfold stone slab hid its secret well. While refugees begged at the castle gates, his family ate from hidden bounty, not just surviving, but trading a cup of barley for news, a handful of nuts for repairs. By spring, when the soldiers moved on, Guillaume unearthed his pits with the reverence of a priest uncovering relics. The grain, though musty, was edible. The turnips had sprouted but were sweet, and the hazelnuts, they became seed for the first new crop. What separates Guillaume from the countless victims of medieval war wasn't luck, it was time. He understood that survival isn't just about reacting to disaster, but anticipating its rhythms. Modern preppers with their bunkers and freeze-dried meals echo his logic, but his real lesson was subtler. By burying food in stages, he accounted for human nature. Desperation has limits. Most thieves stop digging when they think there's nothing left to find. Now trade the earthy scent of hidden grain for the musty fragrance of parchment, where a different kind of preservation unfolded. In a monastery's shadowed scriptorium, Brother Anselm faced a dilemma: how to save knowledge from an enemy that burned books first and asked questions never. His solution: a library no torch could touch. Brother Anselm's hands shook as he pressed another parchment into the hollowed-out log, its wax seal still warm from the abbey's candle. Outside, the shouts grew louder. Northmen had breached the monastery walls, their torches already licking at the scriptorium door. But Anselm had spent months preparing for this moment. While his brothers fled or prayed, he worked with the calm precision of a man who knew books burned faster than flesh. Each manuscript tucked into the log was wrapped in oiled sheepskin, then sealed with pine resin to repel damp. Aristotle's treatises nestled beside Celtic herbals. A crumbling copy of Virgil's Georgics shared space with a Moorish star chart. The log itself was no random choice. It came from a cedar tree felled years earlier, its wood naturally resistant to rot and insects. What made Anselm's act extraordinary wasn't just the risk, it was the logistics. Over 3 moonless nights, he'd smuggled the heaviest tomes to a cave half a day's hike north, using a fisherman's path along the cliffs. The route was treacherous, slick with seaweed and prone to rockslides, but its obscurity was its shield. Inside the cave, he'd built shelves from driftwood, positioned where groundwater dripped just enough to maintain humidity without causing mold. Even the cave's entrance faced east, ensuring morning sun could chase away dampness without fading the ink. The invaders never found his stash. They burned the scriptorium, yes, but only after Anselm had slipped the last log into the cave, a hollowed-out oak containing the abbey's greatest treasure, a 6th century manuscript of Pliny's natural history, annotated by generations of scholars. When the raiders finally sailed away, leaving the monastery in ashes, Anselm returned not to rebuild, but to retrieve. For 17 years, he lived as a hermit in that cave, copying the salvaged texts onto fresh vellum made from the hides of wild goats. By the time a wandering bishop stumbled upon him, Anselm's beard had gone white, but his legacy was indelible. The bishop's letter to Rome still survives. I found a man who saved not just words, but the light they carry. Now shift from the scholar's solitude to the bustling world of trade, where a widow named Mathilda turned grief into strategy. While nobles squabbled over titles, she built something far more durable, an invisible network of favors and secrets that would outlast any dynasty. Mathilda's first clue came when the tax collector paused too long at her husband's ledger. The flicker in his eyes wasn't greed, it was fear. The numbers didn't add up, and in 1438, discrepancies could mean a noose. But where her late husband had seen risk, Mathilda saw leverage. That night, she invited the collector's wife to supper, casually mentioning she'd noticed odd entries in the records. No threat was spoken, but by dawn, her taxes were halved. This was no accident, it was the birth of a system. Mathilda's real genius lay in her web of connections. The weaver's daughter who delivered linens also carried gossip from the castle kitchens. The salt merchant's cough signaled when patrols were lax. Even the midwife, ostensibly there to treat Mathilda's headaches, traded whispers about which noble ladies were with child, and by whom. Piece by piece, she assembled a mosaic of influence more precise than any map. When the harvest failed in 1441, Mathilda didn't hoard like her neighbors. She traded. A barrel of salted herring bought silence about a knight's bastard son. A bolt of Flemish cloth secured preferential treatment at the mill. By the time the crisis passed, she controlled half the grain stores in the region, not through force, but through the unspoken understanding that some debts aren't paid in coin. Her greatest triumph came when the Duke himself summoned her, not to demand tribute but to ask advice. The lesson: survival isn't always about what you own sometimes, it's about what others think you know. Mathilda's network outlived her by decades, proof that the strongest chains aren't forged of iron, but of carefully curated secrets. And as we'll see next, those secrets could take even stranger forms, like the alchemist who convinced a king that lead could buy immortality. The loom in Alex's cottage never stopped humming after her husband's funeral. While other widows starved or remarried out of necessity, she turned grief into thread literally. Her fingers, cracked from winter cold, worked miracles with the last of the flax harvest, weaving cloth so fine the local merchant paid double, but Alex didn't sell for coin. She bartered 1 length of linen for a sack of barley, 2 for a side of salted pork, 3 for the blacksmith's help repairing her roof. By spring, her cottage had become a bustling hub where neighbors traded not just goods but skills. The miller's son fixed her fence in exchange for a tunic. The midwife taught her daughter herb lore for a bolt of cloth. What began as survival soon transformed the village economy. When famine struck, Alex's storeroom held not just fabric but relationships, a network of favors owed and repaid. She negotiated with traveling merchants to bypass greedy middlemen, bringing in grain from fertile regions untouched by drought. Her masterstroke, convincing the Weavers' Guild, an all-male bastion, to grant her a license by proving her dyes didn't fade, a quality even their members couldn't match. By the time the harvests returned, she'd built something rarer than wealth, resilience woven into the community itself. Now, trade the clatter of looms for the rustle of leaves underfoot, where a different kind of resourcefulness took root. 8-year-old Martin should have died the night bandits razed his village. Instead, he woke in a thicket, his tunic singed, his only companion a stray dog nosing his hand. Most children would have wept or wandered until wolves found them. Martin observed. The dog knew things: where rabbits burrowed, which berries made birds sluggish but not dead, how to dig for water near willow roots. Martin followed its lead but added human cunning. He twisted grass into snares, lined them with the dog's scent to mask his own. He piled stones in creek beds to trap fish, then smoked them over fires too small to be spotted. When winter came, he sewed a cloak from squirrel pelts using the dog's shed fur for thread. His survival wasn't just luck, it was mimicry. The dog avoided open fields at dawn when predators hunted, so did Martin. It rolled in mint leaves to mask its scent from bears. He did the same. By the time a woodsman found him 2 years later, Martin spoke more in whistles and gestures than words. He'd learned the forest's language by listening to a teacher who never said a word. The lesson: adaptation isn't always about innovation. Sometimes it's about humility. While lords built castles to dominate nature, a child survived by becoming part of it. And as we'll soon see, that same principle applied in the unlikeliest of places, a besieged cathedral where the bell ringer turned silence into a weapon. The first thing the hunters noticed wasn't the boy. It was the footprints, too small for a wolf, too deep for a fox, and arranged in a pattern that made no sense. 3 steps on 2 legs, then 4 on all fours, as if the creature couldn't decide how to move. When they finally spotted him crouched over a stream, lapping water like a deer, he was more shadow than child, hair matted with resin, skin scabbed with old burns, his only clothing a cloak of stitched rabbit pelts. The villagers would later swear he'd been missing for 5 winters, vanished the night bandits torched his farmstead. Yet here he was, alive in ways no one expected. What unfolded next wasn't just survival, it was transformation. The boy, whom the hunters called Wren for his darting movements, had learned the forest's rhythms with eerie precision. He dug for grubs where woodpeckers tapped, peeled bark to lick the sap beneath, and most startlingly, knew which mushrooms made squirrels stagger. When a healer tried to bathe him, he bit through the rope tying his wrist and vanished into the rafters, clinging to the beams like a bat. Yet for all his wildness, flashes of humanity remained. On the 3rd night, he left a dead grouse by the hearth, its neck neatly broken, not a gift, but a trade for the blanket they'd taken from him. The true revelation came when an old woodsman tried speaking to him in the dialect of charcoal burners, a slang-riddled tongue barely considered language. Wren's eyes locked onto the man's lips. Slowly, haltingly, he echoed the words not with a child's voice, but with the rasping growl of someone who'd learned speech from listening to crows. Over months, he relearned human ways, though some habits never faded. He still tilted his head at unfamiliar sounds like a fox pinpointing prey, and his fingers, calloused from digging, could sense vibrations in the earth minutes before hoofbeats arrived. Wren's story forces us to question what makes us human. Was it the language he eventually reclaimed, or the silent wisdom he'd gained in its absence? Modern scientists would call his adaptation feral child syndrome. But medieval villagers saw something else, a living bridge between their world and the wild. His greatest lesson wasn't about endurance, it was about fluidity. The forest hadn't just sheltered him, it had rewritten him. Now, shift from the whispering leaves to the warm scent of rising bread, a different kind of salvation. In the walled city of Tours, a baker named Jehan faced an impossible task: feed thousands with a handful of grain. His solution, a deception so audacious it became legend. While nobles hoarded wheat, Jehan's ovens never cooled. The secret lay not in what he baked, but what he mixed in: ground chestnuts, normally fit only for pigs, roasted until their bitterness faded. Blended with rye and a pinch of salt, they yielded a dense, nutty loaf that kept hunger at bay. But Jehan's brilliance was in the rollout. He gifted the first batches to the city guards, ensuring they'd turn blind eyes to his midnight flour deliveries. He taught beggars to sing rhymes praising the bread's hearty earth flavor, spreading demand faster than gossip. When the bishop accused him of heresy for defiling God's grain, Jehan presented him with a loaf shaped like a cross-baked hollow, so it seemed larger than it was. The gesture bought him time. By the time the siege lifted, half the city preferred his chestnut bread, and the recipe outlived him by centuries. Here's the twist: Jehan wasn't just staving off starvation. He'd proven that survival often depends on reframing scarcity. What others saw as famine food, he branded as tradition. Today, Tourangeau elders still argue whether their famous pain de châtaigner began as desperation or genius, but perhaps that's the point. The line between the two is thinner than a baker's blade. The air in Toulouse reeked of desperation, a metallic tang of unwashed bodies, and the sour sting of empty stomachs. The siege had dragged on for months, and Baker Etienne's once busy shop stood eerily silent, its shelves stripped bare. The city's grain reserves were down to a few moldy sacks, and the Count's soldiers had begun confiscating even those for the army. But Etienne had been quietly stockpiling an ingredient no one would steal: sawdust from his brother's carpentry workshop. At first, it was just a pinch mixed into the dough, enough to add bulk without altering the taste. But as hunger tightened its grip, Etienne's recipe grew bolder. He soaked the sawdust overnight to soften its grit, then blended it with ground acorns and a trickle of molasses for color. The resulting loaves were dense as bricks, but they quieted stomachs. His true genius, though, lay in distribution. He baked the sawdust bread in tiny, identical rolls, each no larger than a child's fist. "Small portions keep hope alive," he told his apprentices. "A man who gets a whole loaf today may hoard it, but give him a morsel each morning, and he'll believe more is coming." The scheme wasn't without risk. When a nobleman's steward accused him of fraud, Etienne demonstrated his craft with theatrical flair. He split a loaf before the crowd, revealing its coarse interior. "Would you prefer half a portion of pure flour," he challenged, "or a full belly?" The crowd's roar settled the matter. By the siege's end, his sawdust bread had fed over 3,000 souls and birthed an unexpected legacy. Generations later, Toulouse's bakers still add a handful of bran to their dough, a nod to the man who proved survival sometimes means redefining what's edible. Now, let's step from the flour-dusted shadows of the bakery to the grim light of a prison cell, where a different kind of ingenuity flourished. Chained to a dungeon wall, a captured knight named Raymond faced a dilemma: how to warn his allies of the enemy's plans without his jailers noticing. His solution, a code woven into the most mundane act of all: singing. Every evening, the guards dragged Raymond to the castle yard for air, his shackles clinking like macabre chimes. There he'd hum folk tunes, or so they thought. The melodies were maps. A rising scale marked the location of hidden supply routes. A repeated triplet hinted at traitors in the garrison. The real masterpiece was his cough, a syncopated rhythm that signaled which gates were lightly guarded. It worked because Raymond understood his enemy's blind spot. They expected ciphers in scrolls or whispers, not in a man's off-key singing. When his allies stormed the castle months later, they moved with uncanny precision, freeing prisoners and seizing armories exactly where his songs had directed. The lesson: survival isn't always about strength or secrecy. Sometimes it's about hiding your brilliance in plain sight, wrapped in something too ordinary to suspect. The cell stank of damp straw and unwashed bodies, but Guillaume's mind raced faster than any free man's. Captured behind enemy lines after his disguise failed, the spy now faced a choice: resign himself to the executioner's block or turn his prison into a weapon. The guards had stripped him of everything except the half-rotten lemon slipped into his porridge by a sympathetic cook. To them, it was just a scurvy remedy. To Guillaume, it was a key. Each night, while rats gnawed at the sleeping prisoner's toes, he dipped a chicken bone into the lemon's juice and scrawled on scraps of discarded parchment. The words vanished as they dried unless held near a candle's flame. His messages weren't pleas for mercy, but tactical diagrams, guard rotations sketched in citrus, weak points in the dungeon's mortar marked with dotted lines. The real stroke of genius, his innocent requests for reading material. The jailers, eager to appear cultured, brought him devotional books, their margins soon filled with invisible troop movements and rally points. The escape unfolded like one of Guillaume's carefully plotted scripts. A riot erupted in the far cell block distraction courtesy of a prisoner paid with promises scribbled in lemon. As guards rushed toward the noise, allies outside intercepted a pious book gifted to the local priest, its heated pages revealing plans for the east wall's crumbling section. By dawn, Guillaume was gone, his cell littered with seemingly blank parchments. The jailers never suspected the truth. The most dangerous tool in espionage isn't a dagger or a lockpick, but a mind that sees potential where others see only fruit. Now trade the spy's shadowy world for the open hillsides of Provence, where an illiterate shepherd named Pascal read the sky like others read scripture. While scholars pored over astrology charts, he predicted storms by watching how ants carried their eggs uphill days before the first cloud appeared. His flock always reached shelter before the hail fell. His warnings passed through villages in a chain of whistled tunes, each melody coded for a different threat. A rising trill meant lightning, 3 short notes signaled flash floods. What made Pascal's wisdom extraordinary wasn't just its accuracy, it was its democratization. Unlike the guarded secrets of alchemists or the Latin-locked knowledge of monks, his forecasts belonged to everyone. When a nobleman offered him gold for private warnings, Pascal simply pointed to the children already mimicking his whistles in the marketplace. Survival, he proved, isn't hoarded, it's shared. And as we'll see next, that same principle would save an entire coastal town when the tides turned against them. The wind carried a strange scent the morning old Benoit first sensed disaster, a metallic tang, like wet iron, that made his sheep restless. For 3 generations, his family had tended flocks in the Rhone Valley, and every shepherd knew the land spoke in signs. The way ants built their hills higher before storms, how oak leaves curled tight when floods were coming, but this was different. The river's usual murmur had gone silent, replaced by an eerie hush. And the birds, always the birds, had vanished from the willow groves. Benoit didn't wait for confirmation. He drove his flock uphill at dawn, stopping at each cottage along the way. To the miller, he muttered about eels swimming sideways in the creek, a sure sign of rising groundwater. To the baker's wife, he pointed out the unnatural redness of the sunset. By noon, half the village was hauling grain sacks to the chapel on the bluff, while the other half laughed at the crazy shepherd. But Benoit's grandfather had taught him one unshakable truth: nature warns twice. The first sign is a whisper, the second a scream. That night, the scream came a thunderous crack as the river burst its banks, swallowing the lower fields in a single gulp. What saved them wasn't just Benoit's knowledge, it was his timing. He'd calculated the flood's path by the lay of the land, knowing which hollows would fill first. While others scrambled at the last moment, his people had already moved livestock to the high pastures and sealed their wells against contamination. The village survived not because they were lucky, but because they'd learned to listen to voices older than written history. Now shift from the sodden valleys to the glittering world of a very different kind of foresight. In the bustling trade city of Bruges, a jeweler named Clara faced her own impending disaster, not of water but of war. As rumors swirled of approaching armies, her neighbors frantically sold their treasures for pennies, but Clara had spent a lifetime hiding value in plain sight. Her workshop's floorboards concealed a hollow space where gemstones could be swapped for worthless glass replicas in minutes. Her masterstroke, a necklace displayed in her window, its gaudy paste jewels deliberately flawed, a decoy so obvious thieves would overlook the real treasures sewn into the hem of her cloak or baked inside loaves of bread. When soldiers finally ransacked the city, they tore apart her shop, finding only trinkets. Clara's true fortune lay elsewhere, in the trust she'd built with a network of widows and orphans, each sheltering a single piece of her collection. No one person held enough to tempt betrayal, yet together they formed a mosaic of resilience. Her legacy wasn't just in the gems she reclaimed after the war. It was in proving that survival sometimes means scattering your light so widely that no single gust can blow it out. The jeweler's hands trembled as he kneaded the dough, his fingers sticky with flour and fear. The raid had come at dawn, soldiers kicking indoors, their swords glinting like teeth in the torchlight. They'd already ransacked the shop next door, and now the clatter of armor grew louder in the street. But Henry of Rouen wasn't just any craftsman. He was a man who'd spent decades hiding beauty in plain sight. With one swift motion, he pressed a dozen uncut sapphires into the loaf's soft center, folding them deep into the gluten's embrace. The trick wasn't just concealment, it was psychology. Who would suspect a humble baker fleeing with his breakfast? By the time the soldiers burst in, Henry was already chewing, his cheeks bulging with the last crust. They tore apart his workbench, smashed his tools, even slit open his mattress, but the bread, warm, ordinary, smelling of yeast, sat untouched on the counter. One soldier pocketed it absently as they left, only to toss it aside in the square when it failed to gleam. Henry retrieved it later, brushing off dirt to extract every last stone. What makes his story remarkable isn't just the stunt, it's what came after. When peace returned, those very gems became the foundation of his new workshop. But this time he built differently. His apprentices learned to carve hidden compartments into chair legs and false bottoms in inkwells. His clients, mostly widows and merchants, received their purchases wrapped in greasy parchment, disguised as sausages or wheels of cheese. Henry's greatest legacy wasn't the jewels he saved, but the mindset he spread. That survival isn't about resisting destruction, but outsmarting it through the mundane. Now shift from the flower-dusted streets of Rouen to the stark silence of a cloister in Avignon, where Sister Marguerite redefined sanctuary. While plague carts rattled through cities, her convent remained untouched, not by miracle, but by meticulous design. The sisters drank only boiled water drawn from their own well, washed linens in vinegar, and tended an herb garden behind walls so high even rats couldn't scale them. But Marguerite's true innovation was in the chapel's layout. She'd redesigned the pews to face outward, spacing them farther apart than tradition dictated. Prayer need not be crowded to be holy, she insisted. When visiting bishops protested, she pointed to the scripture above the door. God is not in the multitude, but in the breath between. Her method seemed extreme until the death counts mounted. While neighboring monasteries lost half their inhabitants, Marguerite's sisters thrived, their isolation mistaken for piety rather than precaution. The lesson was clear. Sometimes survival means rewriting the rules before disaster strikes. Centuries later, archaeologists would find the convent's records buried beneath the rose garden, their ink still legible. Between hymns and herbal remedies, Marguerite had penned a single line that said it all. The safest fortress isn't made of stone, but of foresight. Now imagine a different kind of stronghold, one that moved. Along the peat bogs of Flanders, an entire village took to the water when invaders came, floating their homes like ducks on a pond. The convent's gates didn't just close, they vanished. Where thick oak doors once welcomed pilgrims, a seamless wall of mortar now stood, its surface unbroken even by a keyhole. Inside, the Sisters of St. Agnes had taken isolation beyond seclusion. They'd erased the very idea of an entrance. No one came in, no one went out, not for births, not for deaths, not even when the bishop himself pounded on the stones with his crozier. While the Black Death raged beyond their walls, their gardens flourished, their well ran pure, and their choirs' hymns floated over empty courtyards. Their secret wasn't magic, it was mathematics. Years before the plague arrived, Sister Perpetua, the convent's infirmarian, had studied outbreaks like a general preparing for siege. She calculated exactly how much grain their storehouses could hold, how many apple trees they could nurture within the walls, even how to recycle urine for tanning leather. Every habit was a calculation. Hands washed in vinegar before meals, latrines dug downhill from the well, letters from the outside world read aloud only after being smoked over juniper flames. The sisters didn't just avoid disease, they engineered its impossibility. When a novice smuggled in a ribbon from her sweetheart, the entire convent fasted for a month to reinforce the lesson. Survival demanded absolute discipline. Their success wasn't just in defiance of the plague, but of human nature itself. While other monasteries took in the sick as holy duty, these women understood a harder truth. Sometimes mercy means saying no. Centuries later, archaeologists would find their ledgers, pages filled with crop rotations and lunar cycles, proving their isolation wasn't fear, but precision. The lesson: walls don't save lives, systems do. Now, shift from silent cloisters to the raucous streets of Naples, where a scribe named Lorenzo turned deception into an art form. Facing execution for forging a noble's will, he staged his own death so convincingly, the judge ordered his corpse thrown into the bay. The trick wasn't in the acting, it was in the paperwork. Lorenzo had spent years studying the city's burial records, noting how often unidentified bodies washed ashore. On the eve of his sentencing, he bribed a fisherman to discover a corpse matching his description, right down to the ink-stained fingers. But the real brilliance came after. While officials celebrated his demise, Lorenzo disguised himself as a notary's clerk, using his forged skills to create a new identity, one with spotless credentials. His second life lasted longer than his first, proving that sometimes survival isn't about facing your enemies, but letting them think they've already won. The ink on Carlo's death warrant was still damp when he began his performance. Condemned for penning letters that exposed a nobleman's corruption, he had one night to stage an escape worthy of the plays he'd secretly adored. His tools: a bladder of pig's blood smuggled in by a sympathetic guard, a rusty nail for dramatic effect, and the one skill no one could confiscate: his flair for the theatrical. As dawn's first light crept through the prison grate, Carlo let out a guttural scream, slammed the nail against his temple just hard enough to draw a trickle of real blood, then bit down on the bladder. The effect was horrifyingly convincing: crimson gushing from his mouth, his body convulsing before going still. Even the executioner crossed himself when they dragged the corpse away. But Carlo's true artistry began in the charnel house. While guards debated dumping him in the river, he lay motionless until the stench of actual corpses masked his breathing. Then came the disguise, swapping his bloodied tunic for a grave digger's stolen cloak, rubbing dirt into his skin until he looked like just another laborer shuffling home after a grim night's work. His masterpiece: walking past the same guards who'd jailed him, coughing into his sleeve like a consumptive old man, a role so mundane it rendered him invisible. The lesson wasn't just in deception, but in timing. Carlo knew people see what they expect. A dead man doesn't limp through the marketplace buying bread. By leaning into their assumptions, even lingering near the scaffold to watch his own wanted poster go up, he turned audacity into armor. Years later, scribes in Naples still whisper of the man who cheated death not with magic, but with a pig's bladder and flawless comedic instinct. Now trade the scribe's ink-stained fingers for the calloused hands of a Breton fisherman who turned the tides of misfortune into his greatest catch. While nobles starved behind castle walls, old Yannick fed his village with a net woven from desperation and cunning literally. When the war blocked trade routes and salt became rarer than gold, he didn't just mourn the loss of his usual hauls. He studied the currents. Late one autumn night, Yannick rowed beyond the bay where others feared to go, dropping his nets not for fish, but for the seaweed that clung to half-sunken shipwrecks. Washed and dried, the kelp yielded a briny substitute for salt, but his real innovation was in distribution. Instead of hoarding, he traded bundles to shepherds for wool, to potters for jars, creating a barter chain that stretched inland. By winter's end, his peasant salt seasoned stews in manors and hovels alike. What made Yannick's survival genius wasn't just resourcefulness, it was reciprocity. He taught the baker to pack bread in kelp to keep it fresh, the tanner to use it for curing hides. Soon, the whole coast thrived on his accidental economy. When soldiers finally came demanding tribute, they found no stockpiles to confiscate, just a village where every hearth knew how to turn the sea's cast-offs into feast. The true measure of survival, Yannick proved, isn't what you take from the world, it's what you teach others to see. The nets came up empty again, and the fishermen of Dunwich knew why. Soldiers patrolled the wharves at dawn, seizing every cod and herring for the Baron's army, leaving families to gnaw on scraps of salted kelp. But old Thomas had spent 40 years reading the sea's moods. He noticed what the occupiers missed. The soldiers only watched the boats, not the currents, so he began dropping his nets at midnight, hauling them in under cover of fog, then rowing not to the docks but to a half-sunken cave west of the cliffs. There, village children waited with baskets, their bare feet silent on the whetstone. Each fish was gutted and buried in barrels of salt within minutes, its silver scales hidden beneath layers of dried seaweed. Thomas's genius wasn't just in stealth, it was in strategy. He let the soldiers confiscate just enough to avoid suspicion. A few meager catches forgotten in his boat, a handful of flounder left visible in his creel. Meanwhile, his real haul fed the town through a system so simple it defied detection. The baker's daughter traded loaves for fish, the blacksmith accepted them as payment for repairing Thomas's oars, and the midwife distributed them to new mothers too weak to stand. By the time winter froze the harbor, the rebellion had spread. Other fishermen adopted his methods, using hollowed-out buoys to float contraband catches ashore. The soldiers never caught on. They assumed hunger would break the town's spirit. Instead, it forged something fiercer, a community that fed itself on ingenuity and tides. Thomas's legacy wasn't just in the meals he provided, but in the lesson he embedded. Sometimes the quietest acts of defiance are the most nourishing. Now shift from salt-stung shores to the clang of a blacksmith's forge, where a very different kind of deception took shape. Sir Aldrich's armor gleamed like any other knight's, its steel polished to a mirror sheen. But the craftsman who'd forged it knew the truth. Those ornate scrollwork designs weren't mere decoration. They concealed a lattice of slender channels, each one just wide enough to hold a single sheet of parchment. The trick wasn't in the hiding, but in the timing. Aldrich, a minor noble with a talent for diplomacy, used his armor's secret to carry messages between besieged castles. Inspecting guards might strip him of his sword or cloak, but no one demanded a knight remove his breastplate. Behind enemy lines, he'd accidentally bump into a fellow noble, transferring maps or troop movements with a brush of their gauntlets. His masterstroke, the armor's inner lining, was waxed linen, flammable enough that, if captured, he could thrust a torch to his chest and watch the evidence dissolve in smoke. What made Aldrich's ruse extraordinary wasn't just the engineering, it was the psychology. He understood that people see what they expect. A knight's armor was a symbol of brute force, not subtlety. By weaponizing that assumption, he proved that the strongest defenses aren't always made of steel. Sometimes they're crafted from the gaps in others' imaginations. Sir Bertrand's helmet looked like something out of a nightmare, a leather faceplate studded with tiny pouches that reeked of rosemary and cloves, its eye holes fitted with thin discs of polished quartz. While other knights rode into battle fearing swords and arrows, he dreaded an invisible enemy, the miasma of disease that clung to besieged cities like a curse. The year was 1368, and the Black Death had returned with a vengeance, yet Bertrand's company remained untouched. His secret wasn't divine favor, it was observation. As a young squire, he'd noticed something odd. Physicians who carried sachets of pungent herbs rarely fell ill. So he commissioned an armorer to modify his visor, lining it with lavender, mint, and crushed juniper berries. The design was ridiculed at first. "Do you fear flowers more than French steel?" jeered his comrades, but when entire garrisons began collapsing mid-siege, their skin black with buboes, Bertrand's men stayed healthy. He took the concept further, ordering his troops to soak their gambesons in vinegar and avoid drinking from communal cisterns. His methods weren't just superstition, they were proto-science. We now know the herbs he used contain antimicrobial compounds, and vinegar's acidity kills bacteria. But Bertrand's real genius lay in his refusal to accept the era's fatalism. Where others saw inevitable doom, he saw patterns to exploit. Centuries before germ theory, this masked knight grasped a fundamental truth: survival often means defending against threats you can't even see. Now turn from the clatter of armor to the rhythmic clack of a loom, where an even subtler rebellion took shape. In the walled city of Ghent, a weaver named Caitlene didn't just make cloth, she wove a clandestine communication network. When soldiers imposed a curfew to crush dissent, she encoded messages in the patterns of her tapestries. A knot at the edge of a floral design marked a safe house. A stray red thread warned of patrols. Her greatest creation, a funeral pall embroidered with saints that, when held to candlelight, revealed a map of secret tunnels beneath the city square. What made Caitlin's system extraordinary wasn't just its cleverness, it was its scalability. She taught other weavers to replicate the technique, turning mundane market transactions into intelligence drops. A merchant might purchase a bolt of cloth, only to find the selvage edge stitched with troop movements. Unlike ink, thread left no incriminating stains when burned. And because women's work was considered trivial, soldiers never thought to inspect their bobbins. Her legacy endures in the most unexpected places. Modern fiber artists still use Ghent knots as a tribute. But the deeper lesson resonates beyond crafts. Sometimes the most powerful weapons are the ones everyone overlooks. While knights like Bertrand fought visible enemies, Caitlene proved that survival could hinge on something as quiet as a needle pulling thread through linen. Now let's step from the weaver's dim workshop to the blinding glare of a desert fortress, where a different kind of ingenuity thrived. When the Sultan's army surrounded the Crusader outpost of Montjesard, they expected surrender within days. The wells had run dry, and the summer heat turned the stone walls into ovens. But the garrison's commander, a grizzled Templar named Renaud, had spent years studying Bedouin survival tricks. His solution, condensing the enemy's arrogance into water. Each night, while archers exchanged taunts across the battlements, Renaud's men hung woolen blankets from the parapets. The fabric trapped the desert's plummeting nighttime humidity, wringing droplets into cisterns below. By dawn, they'd harvested enough to fill a cask, not much, but sufficient to keep the garrison's leaders lucid. The real stroke of genius came when Renaud ordered the blankets dyed in the Saracens' colors. enemy scouts, spotting the familiar hues fluttering in the wind, assumed their allies had infiltrated the fortress. The resulting confusion bought critical time enough for reinforcements to arrive. Renaud's tactics remind us that survival isn't always about strength or supplies. Sometimes it's about turning your enemies' assumptions against them. Just as Bertrand's mask exploited the blind spot between medicine and superstition, and Caitlaine's threads hid in plain sight, this desert gambit proved that innovation thrives where others see only impossibility. Now prepare to descend into the darkest chapter of all, a story not of battle or plague, but of something far more insidious. In the shadow of the Pyrenees, an entire village survived the Inquisition by perfecting the art of forgetting. The loom's rhythmic clatter was the only sound in Lysette's workshop, a steady, unremarkable noise that masked something extraordinary. To the occupying soldiers patrolling her occupied Flemish town, she was just another weaver producing tapestries for their barracks. But every shuttle pass, every knotted thread held a hidden purpose. Beneath the surface of her floral designs lay a grid of streets, the warp and weft aligning precisely with the alleyways behind her home. A stray crimson thread marked guard rotations. A cluster of tight stitches indicated a crumbling section of the town wall. Her artistry wasn't just decorative, it was cartography in disguise. What made Lysette's scheme brilliant wasn't just the coded maps, it was the delivery. She sold her ordinary linens to merchants who traded across enemy lines, each fold of fabric concealing escape routes for refugees. A pillowcase gifted to the garrison commander's mistress even contained the boldest gambit of all, a path straight through his own courtyard, where sentries grew lax after midnight. The soldiers never suspected the frail woman squinting at her loom was engineering their undoing, one thread at a time. Her greatest innovation lay in the medium itself. Unlike ink, thread left no incriminating stains if discovered. A smuggler caught with a tapestry could claim it was mere inventory, and if danger loomed. Lysette taught her network to unravel the evidence with a single tug, reducing weeks of work to harmless piles of yarn. The system thrived because it exploited the occupiers' blind spot. They saw textiles as trivial women's work, never imagining cloth could be a weapon. When liberation finally came, Lysette's loom fell silent, not because her work was done, but because she'd taught enough others to weave rebellion into every stitch. Now shift from the weaver's quiet defiance to a very different kind of deception, one that shimmered with false gold and alchemical trickery. In the court of a bankrupt duke, an alchemist named Conrad performed his greatest illusion not in a laboratory but in plain sight. While nobles clamored for him to turn lead into treasure, he realized true power lay in making them believe he already had. Conrad's workshop became a theater of misdirection. Vials of mercury swirled in carefully staged experiments, their silvery dance distracting visitors from the real work happening elsewhere. His apprentice would accidentally spill copper filings near the door, leaving traces that looked like gold dust to the untrained eye. But the masterstroke was psychological. He never claimed success outright. Instead, he let courtiers discover his breakthroughs themselves, like the ledger left open to show a single entry. Projection achieved 12 ounces, 3 grains. The Duke's treasurer, peering over Conrad's shoulder, swore he saw the number change from 11 before his eyes, a trick of candlelight and a quick finger. The alchemist's survival hinged on understanding human nature better than metallurgy. When creditors demanded results, he produced a single golden button, actually brass plated with gold leaf, claiming it was the first fruit of a years-long process. The delay bought him time to flee before the ruse unraveled. His legacy wasn't in failed transmutations, but in proving that perception could be alchemized far more profitably than metal. Where Lysette wove escape from thread, Conrad spun credibility from thin air. Both understood the same truth. In desperate times, the most powerful illusions are the ones people choose to believe. The dungeon reeked of damp stone and despair, but the alchemist's hands never faltered. Condemned as a heretic for claiming poison could heal, Brother Theobald had been given one final chance to prove his theories, not to save his life, but to spare the prisoners dying of fever in the next cell. With a smuggled mortar and pestle, he ground nightshade berries into a paste so potent a single drop could stop a man's heart. Then came the gamble, diluting it in rainwater until the mixture turned pale as morning mist. "The dose makes the remedy," he whispered, pressing the vial into the jailer's trembling hand. "One sip every dawn, no more." What followed wasn't just defiance, it was revolution. The prisoners, writhing with plague symptoms, improved within days. Theobald's method flew in the face of medieval medicine, where purging and bleeding were gospel. He'd discovered what we now call hormesis, that tiny amounts of toxins can trigger the body's defenses. His notes, scribbled on stolen parchment, detailed how he'd tested his theory on himself first, enduring weeks of nausea to find the precise threshold between cure and death. But Theobald's real genius lay in his delivery. Knowing the church would never accept his work, he framed it as divine mystery. God hides remedies in plain sight, he told the bishop, pointing to the deadly belladonna growing in the monastery garden. Even serpent's venom heals when wielded with wisdom. The ruse worked. His holy tonic was distributed under clerical supervision, saving hundreds during the next outbreak. Centuries before vaccines, this imprisoned visionary grasped a truth that would reshape medicine. Sometimes, survival means embracing the very thing that terrifies us. These 24 stories, from Marco's Venetian cellar to Theobald's dungeon laboratory, share a common thread. Survival in the Middle Ages wasn't about brute strength or blind luck. It was about observing patterns others missed, bending constraints into tools, and recognizing that the human mind is the most adaptable resource of all. The linen weaver who isolated plague victims, the shepherd who read the land's warnings, the knight who weaponized perfume, they all triumphed by reimagining their circumstances. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in what these survivors didn't do. They rarely fought systems head-on. Instead, they worked within cracks, turning obscurity into advantage. A weaver's loom became a secret map, a child's silence a disguise, a loaf of bread a vault. Their ingenuity whispers across the centuries. When the world seems rigid, creativity is your leverage. As we close this journey, consider how their resilience mirrors our own modern struggles. Pandemics, wars, famines, the challenges change, but the human capacity to endure does not. These stories remind us that survival isn't just about weathering storms, but learning to dance in the rain. And sometimes, like Theobald's poison, the solutions hide where we least expect them. What connects a medieval linen weaver isolating plague victims to a modern epidemiologist tracking virus mutations? Or a starving peasant foraging weeds to a chef reviving forgotten crops during a supply chain crisis? The distance between these survivors is measured in centuries, but their strategies share the same heartbeat: adaptation through observation. The real magic of these 24 stories isn't just their historical drama, it's how their ingenuity mirrors survival tactics we still use today, often without realizing it. Take Marco, the Venetian merchant who bartered information during the Black Death. His playbook alliances, resource tracking, calculated risk reads like a modern business continuity plan. Corporations now pay consultants to teach supply chain resilience. but Marco understood it instinctively. Survival hinges on seeing connections before they're obvious. When COVID lockdowns emptied grocery shelves, those who thrived weren't the panic buyers, but the adaptable neighbors sharing sourdough starters, restaurants pivoting to meal kits. Like Marco, they turned scarcity into systems. Then there's Agnes, the famine-era forager who saw nourishment where others saw weeds. Her legacy thrives in urban community gardens, planting purslane, once considered a pest, now prized as a vitamin-rich supergreen. Even the CDC's disaster preparedness guides echo her wisdom, listing dandelions as emergency nutrition. But Agnes's deeper lesson was about challenging assumptions. When experts dismissed her methods as primitive, she proved innovation often wears the guise of tradition. Fast forward to climate change farmers reviving drought-resistant medieval crops like spelt and millet, another case of old solutions solving new crises. Sir Godfrey's dungeon escape reveals another timeless truth: constraints breed creativity. His rusty spoon tunnel finds its parallel in modern prison breaks using smuggled nail clippers, or even in tech startups bootstrapping with duct tape solutions. The common thread: limited resources force unconventional thinking. Astronauts train for this reality in NASA, restricted innovation drills, where teams solve problems using only random items aboard a simulated spacecraft, an echo of medieval prisoners repurposing bed straw as rope. Perhaps the most striking modern parallel lies with Sister Marguerite, the nun who redesigned her chapel to curb plague spread. Her spaced-out pews and outdoor services predated social distancing by 6 centuries. During the 2020 pandemic, South Korean churches adopted near-identical measures, using CCTV to monitor seat spacing, proving that germ theory didn't invent infection control. It just explained what observant minds like Marguerite's had already grasped. These survivors' greatest gift wasn't just their individual triumphs, but their blueprint for facing uncertainty. When the next crisis comes, whether a cyber attack, a climate disaster, or a virus we can't yet name, we won't be starting from scratch. We'll be standing on the shoulders of linen weavers and blacksmiths, monks and minstrels, who taught us that survival isn't about predicting the storm, but learning to sail in wild winds. Their stories whisper across time. The tools are always there. It's our willingness to see differently that turns them into lifelines. Now, consider how these lessons might shape your own resilience. That emergency kit in your closet, it's Henry the Blacksmith's spike pit in disguise, your neighborhood WhatsApp group, a digital version of Mathilda's favor network. Even the prepper stocking up on seeds is channeling Guillaume's buried grain pits, just with vacuum-sealed bags instead of straw. The through line is clear: survival isn't a solo act, but a tapestry woven from observation, community, and the courage to try what others dismiss. After all, the next great survival hack might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone bold enough to repurpose it. From merchants bartering secrets in plague-stricken Venice to monks brewing ale as both antiseptic and currency, these survivors of the Middle Ages didn't just endure, they rewrote the rules of what was possible. Their stories tear down the myth that resilience is about brute force or blind luck. Instead, they reveal a truth as relevant today as it was 600 years ago. Survival favors the observant, the adaptable, those who see a spoon not just as a utensil, but as a shovel, a loaf of bread not just as food, but as a hiding place for sapphires. Consider the linen weaver who defied convention by isolating plague victims, a move that cost her social standing but saved countless lives. Or the shepherd who read the silence of birds as clearly as a scholar reads scripture, evacuating his village hours before floodwaters swallowed their homes. These weren't acts of magic, but of meticulous attention. They understood that crises don't create heroes, They reveal the ingenuity that's been there all along, waiting for the moment when convention fails and creativity becomes currency. What makes their legacies timeless isn't just their triumphs, but their methods. The blacksmith who turned scrap metal into caltrops proved that resources are never truly scarce, only our vision of how to use them. The scribe who encoded escape routes in tapestry patterns showed that information is power, especially when it's hidden in plain sight. Even the alchemist who diluted poison into medicine grasped a truth modern science would later confirm. Sometimes the solution lies in mastering the very thing that threatens us. These stories resonate because they're not relics, they're mirrors. When supply chains falter or pandemics loom, we still barter like Marco, forage like Agnes, and build networks like Mathilda. The tools have changed, but the playbook remains. Observe what others overlook, adapt faster than the threat evolves, and above all, trust that no system is so rigid it can't be bent toward survival. As we close this chapter, consider how their ingenuity lives on in you. That emergency fund you squirrel away, it's Guillaume's grain pit in digital form. The way you trade skills with neighbors a haircut for garden vegetables, that's Alex's cloth economy reborn. Even your pandemic sourdough starter carried echoes of Brother Elias's monastery brew, turning scarcity into sustenance. So the next time life feels like a besieged castle or a plague-ridden city, remember, you're heir to 24 generations of problem solvers. Press play on their collective wisdom. Share which story resonated most in the comments. Was it the child who learned the forest's language, or the widow who weaponized gossip? And if you're hungry for more tales of defiance against the odds, subscribe now. Our next adventure waits just beyond the horizon, where history's underdogs become your unexpected guides. Until then, carry this truth like the medieval survivors carried their secrets. Darkness is inevitable, but outsmarting it, that's a choice.